Dobré odpoledne, dámy a pánové, já vás vítám.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third section of the conference entitled Heritage Management and Society. This afternoon we will have the first part of this section, and the second part is coming tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning. Today we have our panelists, David Kovařík from the Institute of Contemporary History, Andrea Průchová, Hrůzová, also from the Institute of Contemporary History, and Michal Kurz from Masaryk Institute and Archives of the Czech Academy of Sciences. Today we have 3 panelists, but only 2 presentations because Andrea and Michal have a common presentation. Both presentations focus on the late 30s and 40s. One presentation from David Kovařík will be on the devastation and extinction of cultural heritage properties. The other presentation is more about the representation. Let me introduce David Kovařík, our first panelist. David is a historian. He works at the Institute for Contemporary History for many years now. He focuses on Czech and Czechoslovak history after 1945, namely with a focus on the post-war transformation of the border areas of the Czech lands. He researches migration processes and national minorities during the communist dictatorship. So he is a player on the same field as myself in research and teaching. David co-authored the publication German-speaking population in Czechoslovakia after 1945. And I know this book very well, and I consider it exceptionally or extremely useful in our field. Currently, David Kovařík is the co-investigator of the project Identification and Permanent Documentation of Cultural Landscape and Settlement Memory of a Community on the example of vanished settlements in Moravia and Silesia. I did not mention his first publication, and I left it for the end on purpose. The book is entitled Transformations of the Czech Borderlands in 1958 to 1960, Demolition Actions in the Czech Borderlands with a view to the development after 1945. This publication is about the same topic as David's presentation today, entitled Devastation and Destruction of Cultural Monuments as a Consequence of Demolition Actions in the Czech Borderland after 1945. Over to you, David, and please try to respect the time frame because we have another presentation and a Q&A session.
Děkuji za slovo.
Thank you very much.
Musím se nasdílet prezentaci.
I will try to share my presentation.
Tak pokud vidíte prezentaci.
I hope you can see my presentation. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks to Matěj for the introduction. In my presentation, I will try to present and recall the fate of cultural monuments that were destroyed, damaged, or found themselves in danger during the state-organized demolition operations in the Czech borderlands that took place from the end of the Second World War to the beginning of the 1960s. These demolitions affected mainly settlements, from individual houses and isolated buildings to entire villages, but other buildings and structures, including historical and cultural monuments, were not spared, including those that were already protected by law at the time. If we were to look for the causes of the disappearance or devastation of monuments in the Czech borderlands, the post-war transformation process played a significant role, which was associated with the national, social, economic, cultural, and last but not least, demographic transformation of these regions, which fundamentally affected the further development and functioning of both the local settlement structure and the cultural landscape. A number of monuments in the border regions disappeared because they remained abandoned and unmaintained for many years until they have fallen into disrepair and decay to the point where they have lost their original heritage or cultural value. Some of the monuments in the borderlands were then physically demolished and razed to the ground in controlled and state-organized demolitions. The largest group of post-war demolitions consisted of residences and farm buildings that remained abandoned and empty after the displacement of their original German inhabitants. The post-war population exchange and further migration movements after 1945 caused the population density in the borderlands to fall by a third compared to the pre-war situation. So there were many empty settlements. The decline was particularly pronounced in mountain and foothill areas such as Šumava, Bohemian Forest, Novohradské hory, or the Jeseníky mountains, where many villages and settlements remained completely empty or only minimally populated. Therefore, in these most affected areas, the Czechoslovak state resorted to the first organized demolitions, which did not spare local monuments, mostly churches or chapels. Another group of demolitions was represented by buildings that had been damaged by deliberate destruction or careless handling. In the first weeks and months after the war, many monuments were looted by the so-called gold diggers, who went around the former Sudetenland to steal and plunder. New settlers often contributed to this damage and destruction, using the abandoned houses and farmhouses left by the Germans, not only for their own profit, but sometimes also as a cheap source of building materials. Moreover, the post-war society of the new settlers was characterized by the absence of tradition and a closer relationship to the new environment and the local material culture. That is, the absence of what previous generations of original inhabitants had built up over centuries in the borderland. Instead, in many places in the border region after 1945, monuments that commemorated the local people and their culture were deliberately destroyed or damaged, if only due to the presence of German inscriptions. And this concerns also some Jewish monuments. Finally, it is necessary to mention one more important factor that led to the demolition of settlements in the Czech borderlands, and that was the military and security interests of the post-war Czechoslovak state. After 1945, several large military camps were established in the border areas for the training of the Czechoslovak army. These were mainly the Boletice and Dobrá Voda military areas in Šumava prameny in the Slavkov forest, hradiště in Doupov mountains, and Ralsko in northern Bohemia, and Libava in northern Moravia, in the foothills of the Jeseníky mountains. Dozens of villages and settlements disappeared in these military training areas, including most of the local monuments that were sometimes targeted during military exercises. In the vicinity of the so-called western border, that is, the state borders with Austria, Germany, and partly with the GDR, a border and forbidden zone was established. Mass demolitions took place continuously in the Czech border region from the end of the Second World War until the 1960s. In the first post-war years, especially between 1945 and 1950, there was a large-scale demolition operation in the border area organized by the National Land Fund. After the war, this institution was in charge of all the agricultural and forestry property confiscated under Presidential Decree number 12 from 1945, which also included most of the rural settlements and farmsteads in the Czech borderlands. Among these confiscations, however, there were many uninhabited, abandoned, or damaged buildings, which were then proposed for removal by demolition. The biggest beneficiaries of these demolitions were the respective national committees, municipal enterprises, agricultural cooperatives, but also interest organizations or individuals from among the populations who used the excavated material mostly to repair their own houses. The implementation of these demolition works and the criteria for the selection of buildings for demolition were contained in the National Land Fund circular issued on the 24th of October 1946, which also stipulated that all buildings proposed for demolition must have a valid certificate from the relevant district committee that they were not subject to the protection of the State Monuments Office. The care of the monuments among these agricultural confiscations is also mentioned in the set of measures on the expeditious removal of demolition sites dated 1949, where the State Monuments Office was charged with drawing up a list of culturally valuable buildings threatened with demolition. At the same time, the conservationists were to prepare a proposal for the preservation and further use of these monuments because, as the document states, if these buildings remain without function, they will fall into disrepair, so that they will eventually have to be demolished anyway. However, as we learn from other contemporary sources, the Heritage Office did not have any list of confiscated monuments at this time, except for former noble residencies, mainly castles and chateaux. Nevertheless, conservationists estimated that among other confiscations, there were about 2,000 more buildings for conservation. Another large-scale demolition operation in the Czech border area was the widespread destruction of settlements and other buildings that were located in the forbidden border zone. This forbidden zone was declared in the provision on the border area issued on the 28th of April 1951 by the Ministry of National Security, which ordered the creation of a closed area along the state border with Austria, Germany, and partly also with the friendly GDR, within a width of 2 to 3 kilometers from the border, from where all the population had to be evicted and where no one was allowed to enter without permission, except for members of the border guard. From November 1951 until the end of April 1952, all the inhabitants were resettled in this restricted area. However, the displacement of residents from the restricted zone left hundreds of empty villages and settlements around the border. And the state and security authorities were faced with the question of how to deal with the depopulated villages. Empty houses and other buildings were a nuisance to border guards on guard duty, and fears abounded that these places could become havens for border infiltrators or hideouts for smugglers or their contraband. Churches were particularly disliked by border guards as they could become an easy landmark in the landscape for undesirable persons. And so, quite soon after the displacement of the local population, there was still a demand for the removal of the abandoned villages and solitary houses in the forbidden zone by razing them to the ground. In order to carry out this task, the Ministry of the Interior issued guidelines for the demolition of buildings and facilities in the prohibited zone on the 16th of August 1952. According to this directive, all buildings in this area were to be demolished, with the exception of selected buildings occupied and used by the border guard or the army. These buildings were mostly larger ones, which were then used as barracks, garages, warehouses, and so on.
Naopak, některé památkové objekty, zejména kostely a jejich věže, posloužily pohraničníkům jako opěrné body a pozorovatelé. Paradoxically, this seizure avoided the complete destruction of some heritage buildings, mostly churches, whose towers also served the border guards as strong points and observation posts from which it was possible to check the surrounding landscape. However, these monuments under the administration of the soldiers and border guards were mostly not properly maintained, which caused that after some time, many of these buildings and facilities also had to be demolished or fell into disrepair and turned into ruins. As for other immovable monuments in the restricted zone that were not taken over by the border guard or the army, they were mostly demolished because security concerns outweighed their cultural and historical value. In the directive on the demolition of buildings and installations in the prohibited zone, there's one paragraph concerning the treatment of religious and other historical monuments. According to this section of the directive, churches and other important monuments were to be inspected before they were demolished, their valuable furnishings secured and transported to a new site designated by the competent regional national committee. The State Office for Religious Affairs also intervened in this matter, which issued its own guideline on the 11th of September 1952, in which it instructed the clerks for religious affairs at the regional committee to arrange, in agreement with the local consistory or the relevant parish authority, for the removal of the furnishings and interior furnishings, such as paintings, statues, bells, organs, and other religious equipment from these demolished churches, chapels, and monasteries in the prohibited zone. We know from the sources that in connection with the establishment of the prohibited zone and the issuing of the directive to remove buildings and facilities in this area, various efforts and attempts were made by the conservationists to save at least the most historically valuable monuments, but they mostly failed. As an example, I'd like to mention the initiative of Dr. Jan Muk, the district conservator for state monument care in Průchová Hradec, who in January 1952 wrote a letter to the local district national committee in which he demanded the preservation of the Church of St. John the Baptist in Mnich u Bystřice, which has an extraordinary historical value as one of the oldest buildings and most valuable Romanesque monuments. His opinion was supported by the director of the State Heritage Institute in Prague, František Petr, who wrote a letter, I quote, from which I quote, "According to the report of the conservator for state monument care in the district of Jindřichův Hradec, there's a danger that the Romanesque church in the village of Mnich could be demolished during the clearance measures. Since the building itself is one of the most precious Romanesque monuments and the interior furnishings are of remarkable artistic value, we request that every effort be made to exclude this church from any demolition measures and to properly secure the inventory from damage or loss." However, even this request did not help, and the church in Mnich was demolished, despite the efforts of the conservationists. Demolition operations in the forbidden zone along the Austrian and Bavarian, but also partly around the Saxon border,
took place between 1953 and 1956. It brought not only the destruction of hundreds of local villages and isolated houses, but also the enormous and irreversible loss of many cultural and historical monuments, as well as the entire cultural landscape around the border. In terms of the number of demolished buildings in the post-war border area, the largest project was the Ministry of the Interior's full-scale demolition operation, which took place between 1959 and 1960. This demolition action affected the entire Czech border area, that is, not only the western border with Austria and Germany, but also the area around the Polish border and the former language islands. If the demolitions of the National Land Fund were done primarily for economic reasons, and the demolition of settlements in the restricted zone for security and military reasons, there were other reasons for the nationwide demolition of the border area in the late 1950s and early 1960s. These included a desire to improve the appearance of the border villages, concern for the health and safety of the citizens. But last but not least, the demolition was also forced by international pressure and the state's poor reputation among foreign visitors who, with the resumption of tourism, began to arrive in the Czechoslovakia. And the first thing they saw after crossing the state border were mostly neglected border towns and villages where there were still many empty and unmaintained houses or other buildings that were falling into disrepair and turning into ruins. However, the mass removal of unoccupied buildings and facilities in the border area, carried out as part of a nationwide demolition operation in 1959 and 1960, brought further destruction to many monuments and historically valuable buildings, even though local monuments were already protected by the then newly approved Monuments Act number 22 from 1958. The Demolition Directive also reiterates the requirement to protect state-protected monuments and to ensure cooperation with the State Office for Conservation and Nature Preservation in order to avoid damaging or even demolishing these buildings during the demolition operation. However, this cooperation has often not worked ideally, so we continue to document demolitions of legally protected monuments and the associated complaints and protests from conservationists. The lack of a central inventory of the individual monuments in the border region that were supposed to be protected and secured from danger of demolition proved to be a huge problem. This was also the reason why the staff of the State Institute for Conservation of Monuments repeatedly made a number of critical comments and complaints about the procedure of the demolition crews, reported various defects and disregard for the applicable laws and measures for the protection of cultural monuments. As an example, on the 21st of May 1955, the Regional Center for Heritage Protection in Pilsen filed a complaint against the demolition of the Baroque Church of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross in Kreuzwinkel in the village of Hamry in the Klatovy district, which was registered as a cultural monument and protected by law. The complaint about this demolition states, I quote, "The permission of the Ministry of Education and Culture was not requested for this demolition in accordance with Section 23 of the relevant law. Thus, an offense has been committed by the responsible party, which we are obliged to report to the district attorney for investigation and appropriate action. This has caused irreparable damage to cultural values, not to mention the fact that the authority of the Ministry of the Interior, which is supposed to protect the law, knowingly violated the law here." On the 23rd of May 1955, a meeting on the demolition of listed buildings was held in the building of the State Institute for Monument Protection in Prague, where a representative of the Ministry of the Interior was also invited and strongly requested, I quote, that in future the Ministry of the Interior should communicate the intention to demolish listed buildings to the Ministry of Education in good time and with sufficient advance notice, so that the matter can be properly considered, and in cases where further protection of monuments will be dispensed with, so that the necessary formalities can be fulfilled before demolition. It was also pointed out at the meeting that it was not always churches and castles that were heritage buildings, so that any demolition should indeed be checked to see whether it was a heritage building under law number 22 from 1958. It was not until September 1959, which was about 5 months after the demolition work began, that an arrangement was concluded between the Ministry of Education and Culture, under which the monument care fell, and the Ministry of the Interior, which managed the demolition operations, to protect and secure the monuments. At the same time as this agreement, an invitation was made to the representatives of the Education and Culture departments of the district national committees to draw up an inventory of listed buildings or buildings of historical and cultural value in their areas of responsibility, unless they had already been demolished or irreparably damaged in the course of the demolition operation. These lists of buildings protected under Act number 22 from 1958 on cultural monuments were to be drawn up in all the districts where demolition operations were underway or planned and sent directly to the Ministry of Education and Culture. Consultations between the conservationists and the representatives of the Ministry of the Interior included discussions about some of the specific monuments that were at risk of demolitions. We learned from preserved sources that the conservationists, for example, rejected the proposed demolition of the Church of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary in the former village of Cetviny in Šumava, primarily because of the surviving original plasterwork with Gothic wall paintings. Similarly, they also opposed the demolition of the pilgrimage church of St. Anne near the village of Šeruby in the Domažlice district, because in this case, it was again an important Baroque monument. Both churches were left standing thanks to the intervention of the conservationists, and after 1989, they received proper repairs and renovation, so that they are now cultural pearls of their surroundings. On the other hand, some of the endangered buildings were approved by the conservationists to be demolished as part of a full-scale demolition operation. This was the fate of, for example, the parish church of St. John and Paul in Kaplice v Pošumaví, which was built in the neo-Romanesque style at the end of the 19th century. The demolition of this church took place on the 4th of June, 1959, by blasting away. And this event is documented photographically by those involved in the demolition, so we can see the documentation, the pictures on the slide. This flat demolition continued, and from the 1960s there were other factors like coal mining, building of water power plants, but that's another chapter. So let me end here, and thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, David, for this presentation of a darker chapter of monument care, or rather heritage destruction in the Czech lands. The discussion related to this presentation will happen at the end of this session after the second presentation, but if you have any questions or comments, do not hesitate to type them in the comments on the YouTube channel that you are watching, and I will read your questions, and I'm sure David Kovařík will give an answer. Now let me introduce the next two speakers.
As you can already see, the next speakers are Andrea Hrůzová and Michal Kurz. Andrea Hrůzová is theorist of visual culture, and she works on research together with the History for Contemporary History, the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes, and she collaborates also with the Charles University in Prague. She has also founded and manages the platform for the study of visual culture, which is called Fresh High, and she has also published articles in foreign magazines, in European Journal of Cultural Studies, and she is author of independent chapters in Palgrave Macmillan and Springer Publishing House. Except for these scientific studies, she is also author of an artistic book entitled We Have Never Been Earth, and she also works as translator. Michal Kurz, on the other hand, he is historian. He concentrates on topics related to the culture of Czechoslovakian Stalinism, with history of Czech monument preservation, especially with regard to cities and modern architecture. He works with the Masaryk Institute of Czech Science Academy, and he also collaborates with the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes. He is also part of the research of physical and symbolical transformation of historic cities, especially Prague, with the Faculty of Arts of Charles University. The today lecture is entitled Heritage Properties in Motion, Cultural Heritage Through the Perspective of Czechoslovak Documentary Film, 1948 to 1956. Thank you for having us. Today we would like to talk about short documentary films from dating back to 1948 to 1956. The film material is newly digitized. It is part of the project which name is Victor E, which is an abbreviation for Visual Culture of Trauma, Obliteration and Reconstruction. And it is also, these documents are also part of a common project from the Czech Republic, French, Germany and Italy. We will attempt to approach this subject from a point of discursive analysis instead of description. So we will not stay within the field of film science nor preservation science, but we will attempt these simplistic readings and we will try to offer multi-field, multi-level analysis. Our effort to provide a multi-level analysis should consider multiple levels of this field, with the monument preservation on one side and the film itself and its tools and instruments on the other. If we base ourselves on the entitlement of the title of our talk today, we can say that the monuments really are in motion. They are on the move in several respects. There were far-reaching changes in property rights because of confiscations, removals, presidential decrees. So that is to say that it is the state who is now responsible for restoration and reparation works of these monuments. And also there are numerous repairs and reconstructions of selected buildings and whole historic city centers, town centers. And the monuments protection and preservation become a part of the dynamic aspect, the dynamic building aspect of Stalinism. And I'm not talking only about castles and chateaus, but also about town centers and town museums. And thirdly, the monuments are in motion, they are on the move because they become the theme of different media. There is a decrease, there is an increase in popularization of the cultural heritage, and they play sort of a legitimization and popularization role. It is a period of dynamic changes, but also, which is significant for us, there is a certain continuity in terms of both personnel, which is symbolized by the personality of Zdeněk Wirth, but there is also a continuity of ideas. And the film becomes, or the film is in the intersection of the interest of enlightenment and information. Let me briefly map the transformation of Czechoslovak short film. It is a period of dynamic changes, but in the field of short film, there is a continuity that we will try to show shortly. The post-war short film continues its pre-war tradition. This tradition was disturbed by the war, but not completely interrupted. The continuity dates back to, or it started in mid-1930s when individual filmmakers are scattered and circulate among private companies and around key personalities. Then in 1945, the Czechoslovak Film Institute is created under the direction of Elmar Klos. In 1948, the transformation into Czechoslovak state film happened. Also, the short film was transformed internally. It's the studio of popular scientific films that is created, and it is this department that is important for us. Also, there is a systematization by the state of this field. It is the Ministry of Information that orders short films. There are three basic functions of the short film. First, it is function of civic education, then it is the aesthetic function, and thirdly, it is an educational function because the short film, because there are novices, new people who come into the short film in order to be trained. Also, the short film becomes an everyday reality in the viewer's life. Viewers or audiences can view short films not only in cinemas and theaters, but also at film festivals, national and internationals. And also they meet with the short film also in the educational context. There were screenings by the popular university that were very frequent. We have prepared a comparison of two short films to begin with, White Telch and Castle's Opening. Both these films were screened for the first time in 1948. You can see the print screen of the first film, White Telch. It is an example of an artistic film, while the second one, Castle's Opening, belongs to the category of social films. We have chosen the first film, White Dog, just an example of a film reflecting the situation before February 1948. As for the creative cast, the direction was done by Jindřich Brychta and the screenplay was written by Petr Klen, whose artistic name was Jindřich Elbl. These two filmmakers had been working together during the Protectorate, but Elbl, after 1948, wasn't able to work within the short film, but Brychta, on the other hand, remained an important figure in the documentary film in Czechoslovakia. I will show you the sample of this film. It is very descriptive, but it is also interesting thanks to Brychta's camera. It is very dynamic, and you will see a very dynamic ride through the arcades, through the arcades of the town of Telč.
A dědictví domácího vkusu, který se ujal v malebných podloubích. A příchozí kráčející v těchto starobylých kulisách životní pohody a leckterého dramatu ocitá se náhle jako v jiném, zapomenutém světě.
Jak jsem již řekla, pro naši komparaci jsme si zvolili další.
For our comparison, we have also chosen another short film entitled Castle's Opening. This film describes the way that society functions after 1948. The author of this film is K.M. Velo, a novice. And this film is described as a social film dedicated to the care of working people with a sharpened constructionist rhetoric, as you will see in the following sample.
Pět hodin. Brány továren se otevřely, dělníci se vracejí do svých domovů. Na závodě pracuje i mnoho učňů, kteří nemají v Praze rodinu a o jejichž ubytování se stará podnik. Po práci na ně vždy čeká autobus, aby je zavezl do učňovského domova. Je jím zámek Vinoř, jeden z 500 zámků, jež byly majetkem nepřátel státu a jež květnová revoluce odevzdala do rukou lidu. Starý anglický park láká mladé následovníky Zátopka k tréninkovému běhu, široká plocha trávníku je v létě jejich hřištěm i studovnou. Mladí dělníci mají statečná srdce. Dovedou stejně dobře bojovat koženými rukavicemi jako dřevěnými figurkami na šachovnici.
Tak jak jsme mohli vidět, ty dva filmy jsou skutečně hodně
As you could see, these two films are very different. Castle's Opening offers a very different view on monuments. The film presents new use of certain castles, primarily with those who were not dedicated to tourism. Except for the castle of Vinoř, you could also find the castle of Hrůzová Skala, where there is a summer camp for university students, as well as the castle of Dobříž, which was the center of Czech Union of Writers since 1945, and another castle, Kamenice nad Lipou, where there was a children's hospital. These castles are products of a time that was stopped, and we can see them at a certain stage of time. The comments and the camera compare throughout the film the motives of the new and the old, as we could see in the scene of the park. There are also symbols of collectiveness, of youth and of children, to prove that new life is coming into and populating the old castles. So this is an attempt to present the castles through the new life that has entered them. We would also like to introduce another short film, a color film from 1956. This is already a film that was created after the restructuring of short film, krátký film. At the same time, the film is in color, which proves that it was an important investment paid by the state, because the colored film was very scarce at the time. Also, there was a very close collaboration on this film between the filmmakers, Svatopluk Studený, the director, and Dobroslava Menslova. Svatopluk Studený is a director model who at the same time is an expert, because Studený himself studied art history, and at the same time he studied old music. So this is why the musical part of the film is often very important to his films. This close collaboration between the filmmaker and an expert is very important. Both of them have been working on the script.
Pyšný a vznešený tyčil se Karlštejn před očima návštěvníka, když stanul před uzavřenou první branou, kterou se dostal teprve do předhradí. Dál mohl vstoupit až po spuštění padacího mostu před druhou branou. Hlavní budovy hradu začínaly císařským palácem a vrcholily ve velké věži, stavbě nejvznosnější i nejpevnější, která byla jeho útočištěm a záštitou. Její protivahou byla nejníže položená hradní věž. V ní byla studna, pramen života a síly na hradě. Z hlouby 92 metrů se čerpala voda šlapacím kolem do věder a byla roznášena po hradě. O něco výše nad studniční věží byla budova purkrabství. V letech 1518 až 1528 ji o nové křídlo rozšířil purkrabí Jan ze Šternberka. Ve světlých síních, pod svítícími hranami klenby, přiléhavě zvané Diamantová, úřadovali jako zástupci krále mocní karlštejnští purkrabí.
Jak jsme mohli vidět v té ukázce pro film Karlštejn, je velice charakteristická
this part of the film, what is very symptomatic for this film is the combination of the shots of the real castle and the wooden models. This film was created in close connection with the trick department of the Czechoslovakian state film. Two different models of the castle were used during the shooting of the film. One of them was directly made for the needs of the film. It was made of wood, it was colored with paints to make it look as realistic as possible. And the other model was an exhibit for the Newcastle exhibition installed at that time. As my colleague already pointed out, an important figure for the creation of this film was Dobroslava Menslova, expert and art historian, who is a specialist in the development of Czech castle architecture, who researched the castle of Karlštejn in the long term. And during the 50s, it was her who drafted the exhibition texts that guides recited to the tourists. Dobroslava Menslova was the wife and co-worker of art historian Václav Mencel. And Václav Mencel, on his part, he had some experience in the field of documentary film as well. He collaborated on 1955 film Centenary Beauty that represented Gothic and Renaissance monuments of the Czech Republic, and he had also experience with collaborating on feature films. He collaborated with the director Otakar Vávra on the Hussy trilogy. So 3 films from the times of Czech Hussitism. With this, we come to the last film that we have chosen. It is a film entitled Moravian Gothic. It is a color film too. It was created by the company Krátký film Brno, Short Film Brno. It is a film made by 2 filmmakers in close cooperation, Jan Fuchsa and Antonín Friedl. Antonín Friedl is an art historian and a specialist in Gothic art. He was one of the most important experts for the work of Master Theodorik. And he also took over the directorship of State Photographic Institute after Zdeněk Wirth. Besides films on historical monuments in southern Moravia, he was also active in in the field of instructional films. So let's see the next part of the film.
Jsme ve 13. století v bazilice svatého Prokopa v Třebíči na Moravě. Zatímco venku za tlustými zdmi chrámu tiskne feudální řád člověka hluboko k zemi, zde učinil umělec vše, aby povznesl lidskou mysl vysoko nad strasti denního života. Neskutečná krása neskutečného, vysněného, nadpozemského světa, to je hlavní estetická funkce gotického chrámu, důmyslnou konstrukcí takřka zbaveného tíže stavební hmoty. Chrám má být pro středověkého člověka branou nebes, kde prý po smrti nebude už vezdejších útrat. Tuto představu stvárnil neznámý sochař do jedinečné výzdoby portálu chrámu v předklášteří u Tišnova z kvostu středoevropského výtvarného umění. Přesně je zde vypodobněna představa středověkého světa. Nadevším králuje Kristus a u jeho nohou z boží milosti posvěceni klečí zakladatelé chrámu. Český král Přemysl Otakar I. a jeho manželka královna Konstancie. Stvárňováním náboženských představ vzdáleno od života není však gotické umění od něho odtrženo. Pozvolna začíná zápas o to, aby se i tento pomyslný náboženský svět přiblížil podobě člověka. Vystižení mateřského štěstí a dětské hravosti v plastice Madony z Brankovic, vyjádření smutku matky nad mrtvým synem v Pětě Jihlavské, obojí je výsledkem těžkého boje umělce o vyjádření reality života.
Pokud bychom se pokusili o nějakou hlubší interpretaci dané ukázky a celého snímku,
we were to provide an interpretation of this film, we would certainly mention the motive of drama, of struggle that was implemented from the Soviet cinema. There is struggle and its depiction at different levels. Firstly, it is the struggle depicted by dynamic camera, by dynamic film language, by the work with light and shade. Then there is the motive of the class struggle between the feudal and bourgeois class. Then there is the depiction of the struggle of the artist within his own creative work. And we can also see the struggle of artistic representation of reality, which shifts from high art to reality, which is a kind of image of the popular instructional short film of the 1950s itself that wanted to popularize the science. At the same time, the film reflects the reality in the context of Marx-Leninist doctrine and attempts to secularize the medieval world. Instead of the people who ordered the monuments, the church, the feudal class, it shifts towards the creators of the work itself, so the popular craftsmen and artists, and this is depicted by a dynamic struggle. It is also important to point out that the realistic character was a criteria, very vague one, but still a criteria also for the contemporary artwork in the framework of the socialist realism. To provide just a brief summary, we wanted to avoid schematic and narrow framing of February. We wanted to weaken the narrative of February 1948 as a rupture. On the contrary, in some aspects, February 1948 is also a moment of acceleration of previous developments in the areas under study. Also, we wanted to point out fundamental importance of cultural heritage for the legitimation and self-presentation of the state socialism regime in its early post-February phase. Thank you for your attention.
Také moc děkujeme za tenhle příspěvek, jak už jsem předpokládal na začátku.
Thank you for this contribution. As I pointed out at the very beginning, it is a very contrasted view to what David Kovařík presented to us, and I think that it is a good thing because thanks to these two contributions we now have a very plastic idea, a 3D idea of 1950s and the relationship to cultural heritage at that time, this relationship being quite ambivalent, at least more ambivalent than it could seem at first glance. We unfortunately are running out of time in today's third section, but we can still spare some 5 minutes for the discussion. So our audience is welcome to stay and watch the rest of this section. So let's see the questions that we have. We have some questions regarding David Kovařík's presentation, but there are also other questions that are popping up now. Martin Gaži, who will give a lecture tomorrow morning, has a question, and he is asking David Kovařík, who was actually organizing the records of monuments and their demolition in 1959. Was it the Czech Institute of Monuments Preservation, or were there some regional centers? So that is the question. And let's mention also the commentary of Kristina Uhlíková, who is the organizer of this conference, and her comment is that the problem was that the inventories of monuments in the bordering regions, but also elsewhere, was not finalized. So it was not clear for certain state authorities what actually is a monument and what isn't. So, David, could you reply to these two questions and comments? You have the floor.
Thank you for this question. It is hard to say because we are lacking sources. The situation was different depending on different places. In the 1950s, it went from the bottom up. So at the district national committees, people were supposed to collaborate with the the border guards. They were supposed to go through the buildings that were about to be demolished and assess their value. And based on this, they were asked to make a list of buildings that were to be taken out of the demolition operation. But we have very few of these lists or inventories in the archives of the Ministry of Interior. There is only one document. It says that the Pilsen regional authority made such a list. And for sure, these lists were made elsewhere too, but they are not preserved. So it was from the bottom upwards, from the region, from the districts to the regions and to the center. Yes, thank you very much for your answer. Let's move on. Mr. Kuntorát is asking Michal Kurz and Andrea Průchová. He says, thank you for the presentation. Have you come across documentary films where sacred monuments would be manipulated? What was the approach in the filming? Mr. Kuntorát says, I have documented this in Levoč, where altars were dismantled to be recorded realistically, as you mentioned as well. Sometimes the monuments or the artifacts were destroyed during the filmmaking. So how were these films made, and was there any manipulation or destruction of the artwork by the filmmakers? Thank you for the question. As for physical manipulation, at this stage of research, I am not aware of such cases. I have no documentation that would give evidence of such things. What is important is the role of expert advisors in Czechoslovak documentary films were frequent manipulators who were showing some processes. So they had a very important, decisive role. For example, in the film Moravian Gothic, there are illuminations, important illuminations and illustrations. So it's the advisor who selected the ones that would be shown, but I have no evidence for the time being. But thank you for this interesting comment. Thank you for your answer. I have several more questions. We have an anonymous question and comment. I do not know the author. It's a polemic with my monography on most, saying that the preservationists were blamed. I will leave that out because I'm not a panelist here. I'm in the role of a moderator. If the comment was not anonymous, I'd be happy to discuss it. So let's move on. There's a question about the accessibility of the films that you showed. Could the film funds that you mentioned be made accessible online? All of these films
mezinárodního výzkumu, který jsem tu zmiňovala, tak jsme společně viděli ještě z fyzických
are on physical copies. They are part of the fund of the National Film Archive. Based on the relevance for our international research, we nominated these films for digitalization. So they are being digitalized. Some of them have already been published by the National Film Archive on their YouTube channel. We are going to use them in the public space. We are planning public screenings for experts and for the public, to festivals, so also abroad. And next year, our research terminates in May 2022, and we will organize a virtual exhibition where part of these films will be screened within different chapters of the presented history. And so on the European Film Gateway, the films will be available. Thank you very much. Matěj added in a comment this information that these films will be published on the European Film Gateway, where they will be available freely. And the question, the anonymous question I mentioned before, was from Vít Jasensky. Then I have two questions here. Mr. Kovalsky is asking where the film that you showed dubbed into other languages, so were they used abroad? Was there a voiceover? And Ms. Uhlíková is asking how were the topics for the films chosen? What were the arguments for the selection? So a brief answer, please. Thank you for these questions. The films were screened also at international film festivals. For example, 100-year-old beauty that we mentioned won the Venice Festival. Another film we showed was screened in Switzerland. So the films were screened abroad as well. And I have to say, I do not know whether there was a voice-over translation. I would have to ask my colleague Lucie Česálková. As for the selection of the topics, there was a communication between the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Information. Also, the short film organization was involved. There was a section devoted to artistic document headed by Jiří Lehovec. Svatopluk Studený was one of the representatives who was negotiating the different films, the different topics. I'm going to hand over to Michal, who did research on this in the National Archive. In these films, these documentaries, there's a frequent motif in post-war Czech films that is using existing material that was recorded after the war, for example, and then it's used again. So this is important while reading the film, and you can see that short films became longer. They had 30 minutes, for example, because they used also the previously recorded material. As for the selection of the topics, from my current research in the archives I have studied across the different institutional funds, I can say that from 1950 onwards, there was a tendency to focus on monuments that were currently being renovated.
A nebo potom v těch naučných filmech primárně se objevovaly skutečně ty záběry z památkových rezervací.
So it was mainly the selected heritage sites, castles, state chateaus, or the Levoča altar. So that was the key thing. And there's the film Tábor, for example, which reflected the contemporary preferences of the cultural policy. So it depended on the current policy. Of course, there was the historiographic narrative. There was a conflict of narratives. There was an emphasis on Gothics and late Renaissance. I'd like to add that we have just digitalized the film, the Bethlehem Chapel, of 40 minutes, showing the whole infrastructure, the construction works, the interpretation of the historic era through the perspective of the communist ideology on the Hussite era. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last words. I just wanted to add that we have just digitalized the film, the Bethlehem Chapel, of 40 minutes. And this film shows the construction works, but also political actors like Zdeněk Nejedlý, Jaroslav Frágner, the architect of the renovation of the chapel. And there's a complex reinterpretation of the Hussite era. Thank you. Čeněk Pícha says hello and he has a question about the role of Expo 50 and Laterna Magica. And Lucie Česálková responded to him saying that this did not initiate the creation of the films, but some materials were recycled. Is there anything you would like to add? I would say that the products of Czech Gothic art, in spite of the fact that we saw a reinterpretation of it from the class perspective, they were also reinterpreted in the spirit of the contemporary narratives, the advancement of the Czech nation, Czech language, and it was an interesting export product. In 1957, there was an exhibition of Czech Gothic art in Paris. There were also representative publications representing the Czechoslovak state on the outside, also to encourage tourism.
Yes, I can confirm that too, that this national question played a huge role but this role wasn't really fulfilled in the border regions which were not connected to the Czech language. And I think that this is something that is shown by the contrast between the two contributions. I've got, well, we are running out of time, but I've got one more question for David Kovařík, which probably will be the last one. David Pecháček, thanks for both contributions. And he has a question to David. It's more of a question of interpretation. Could one tell to what extent the devastation in the bordering regions were a targeted state policy, and to what extent it was more of a revenge of the local populations which have not any ties to the local environment and to the local monuments? So which aspects can be traced within this devastation according to the sources? Thank you for the question. Very briefly, I think it was a combination of many things. It was lack of interest of local population in the cultural heritage and the local heritage. It was also effort to get one's hands on construction material. So it was more things, it was many aspects really. State policy, I don't think so. No. There were many empty houses, including monuments, that dilapidated progressively. These buildings were a threat to the local populations because there are some recordings of children playing in these houses and getting hurt. Also, there was a point in the time when the Germans from Sudetenland were coming to these parts, to these bordering regions. They took photos of these dilapidating buildings and published these photos in newspapers back home. So These were the reasons that led to the devastation of monuments and buildings, abandoned buildings in these regions in general. And I will, of course, answer to all those remaining questions in writing. Yes, thank you for the answer. There is another question which concerns the restoration of films. I don't know, maybe Michal, Andrea, could you add a couple of sentences as answer? So this comment says that there were some reconstruction and renovation works, conservation works that were carried out because of the shooting of the short documentary film. Is that so? Can you confirm that? Were there cases where shooting of these films were the reason why renovation works were carried out? So could you just quickly react to that? Yes, thank you. Thank you for all the questions and for an answer partially. You can see restoration works in the short films themselves. So the restoration is shown in the films, even with professional description. For instance, in the film about Bethlehem Chapel, you can see renovation works that are commented. And there are also other films where restoration is mentioned, and that even speak about foundation of restoration and conservation department of the Czech Academy of Sciences. So it is part of these films too. Thank you. Thank you for your answers. Thank you also for your contributions. I would also like to thank all those who asked questions, who put forward their comments. Thank you for the Q&As. I think that we were able to profit from this limited form of the conference. I hope that tomorrow's section will be in the same spirit as today. As I said, tomorrow we will continue this section, which is entitled Heritage, Management and Society. We will have 4 more contributions. I'm already looking forward to meeting all of you on the second part, during the second part of this section. Thanks to all the organizers, and we will meet again tomorrow morning. Thank you. Goodbye.